What's up everyone, April Dunnam here. In this video, I'm going to walk you through how you can have inline editing inside a Power Apps gallery. This came from one of the questions I got from one of my YouTube subscribers who asked if they could do something similar to the quick edit mode in SharePoint inside Power Apps. So stay tuned and I'll show you how to make this happen in Power Apps. Let's start by looking at our mission. So this came, like I said in the intro, out of a question from one of my subscribers saying, I want to mimic the quick edit experience of SharePoint in my Power Apps application. So let's take a look at the quick edit experience right now. This is a modern SharePoint list. One of the functionalities of modern SharePoint is this quick edit button. So what this does is essentially turns this SharePoint list into an editable grid. So I can come into any one of these items, make a change, tab through, and change all this information inline. And I just exit the quick edit and it saves my changes and takes me back to this mode of the SharePoint list. So this is kind of our goal and what we're striving to mimic inside Power Apps. So I have a new blank Power App, and the list that I'm going to be working off of for this demo is this training list. So we have a title, category, instructor, length, description, video, and all these. So we're going to make kind of an editable grid of this data. First step in doing this is we need to insert a gallery. So we're going to click on the Insert tab, Gallery, and let's choose a blank vertical gallery. I'm just going to drag this and have it take up most of the width of the screen. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in as many text input controls as I need to for the amount of data that's going to be here. So looking back at the list, I want to surface up the title, the category, the length, and the spots available just to keep it simple. So that's 4 total text input controls. When you're usually working with galleries, you're probably used to adding in label controls instead of text inputs. But since we want this to be editable, we're going to add in input controls so that we can enter in information. So I'm going to click in my gallery, select input, and add in a text input control. I'm going to kind of arrange this in the upper left-hand corner of the gallery. And I want to make a few key changes to the text input control itself so that it looks more like an editable grid. First thing you'll notice is this text input has a really thick blue border that is kind of rounded. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to select that text input. We're going to go over to our properties pane, go to the border section. We're going to change this from a 2 thickness to a 1. And I'm going to change the background color by clicking on that icon to more of a lighter gray. Next, I don't want that to be rounded, so I'm going to click on the input again. We're going to go back to that properties pane and find the border radius property and change that to 0 so it's nice and square. A few other properties that we want to configure, if I play this so you can see the functionality, when I hover over this, it has this blue background. I don't want that because that doesn't look that much like the SharePoint list functionality we're wanting to replicate. So I'm going to click on the text input, select the drop-down properties pane, scroll down a bit and find the hover fill property. And we're going to replace what's here because that's that gross blue color. And we can use a relatively new function called self. So self allows me to get data from the current control that I'm in. So I could say self.fill and say just use whatever the fill is of this object's fill. Then I want to go back into my properties pane to the hover border color because the border is also changing when I hover. I don't want that to be blue. I want that to be self dot whatever my normal border color is. So now if I play this out, you'll see as I hover over it, it just stays the same. Now that I have that kind of looking how I want it, I'm just going to come in and copy this text input because we need 4 total of these. And I'm going to paste 3 more of these into my gallery. I'm just going to shrink this down a bit because this height of this object is pretty big. And then I actually need to point this to my data source. So I'm going to click on the gallery itself and you see this select data source option pops up. So I'm going to point that to my training list. And now I need to tie each of these text input controls to my data. If I click on this first one, this is where I want the title field to show. So I can do this by clicking on the text input and navigating to its default property. And we'll replace that hard-coded text and we'll say this item dot title to pull in the title from my list. And I'm just going to repeat that for the other 3 text input boxes. So for this default property, I want that to be this item dot category. This one should be this item dot length, and this one should be this item dot spots available. Looking at the data, spots available and length aren't ever going to be that long of text, so I'm going to shrink the width of each of these a bit, say to 200. We're going to click on the object and just use the properties pane size section and change that width there. Then I'll kind of drag that over a bit. And you want to have them so it looks like a true spreadsheet aligned, so just right next to each other. So you see I dragged that there, and now it's already starting to look like a real spreadsheet. So I'll take the category, I'll drag that over there, and then finally for the title, that could be kind of long, so I'm going to just use the drag and drop to expand that out to make it a little bit wider. Great, now we're getting somewhere. I'm going to save this. The next thing you're going to need is headers. In order to replicate the headers, we're just going to use a series of label controls. So if we click Insert, go to the text dropdown and select Label, we're just going to kind of position these labels above each of these gallery items. So I'll take this one, make it match the width of this column. So this will be the label for my title field. And let's copy that and paste and just create your individual labels for each of these columns. To make it look a little bit more natural, I'm going to change the fill of these labels. So we'll select the label, select the fill property, I'll make it red to match my header, and we'll change the text to white. And just to make it easier, I like to group all of these together so that I can control them as one object. So I'll drag my cursor over all of those so that they're all highlighted, right click and select group. That way if I need to drag this around, I can drag around the entire object. Okay, so far so good. I'm going to add in another item into the backend list just so we can see what it will look like with more than one item in here. When I added in a second item, you'll see that there's quite a bit of space between the items, so we want to clean that up a bit. To do that, we're going to select our gallery, and we want to change this template padding property. There's a 5 in there right now. Let's change that to 0, so that'll shrink up any padding that was there. We might need to move down our gallery a bit now. And then we can make one more adjustment. There's a template size property, so that will kind of control the space between as well. So we can shrink that down a little bit, and I like to go in just increments to see what it's going to look like. So if it's 53 right now, I might jump it down, say to 48, and see what that looks like. So that shrinks it quite a bit. So I'll just keep staggering down until it's how I like it and looks more like a spreadsheet. So let's try 40 that time. Awesome, looks pretty good. They're right on top of each other. Now that we've did all the formatting that we need to make it look correct, we need to work on the function of it. So if I play out the app as is now, I can come into any of these fields, type in the text box, tab, and change the text in all of the different columns and rows. Now all that's missing is a mechanism to save this back to our data source. To build that out, first I'm going to go into Insert, Icons, and I'll put the Save icon in there, just so that we have a button to save this back to our data source. Before I walk through showing how to patch these, first we need to stop and consider performance. The items in a gallery could get fairly large. So ideally, we'd only want to save the items that you've actually changed. So rather than just going into the Save button, looping through every item in the gallery and writing back to the list, we want to find a way to just identify the records that have been changed. So to do that, we need to add in a little bit of additional logic into our gallery. So what I'm going to do, go into my gallery and I'm going to go to the Insert, Input, and I'm going to add a toggle control. Now this control is going to be hidden to the end user, but I'm going to use it to determine if the data in this particular row has changed. So to use this toggle to help us detect changes, we're going to click on the toggle itself, go to the Properties dropdown, and go to its default property. So if it's false, that means it's unchecked, but we change it to true, then it's checked. So if it's true, that would mean there's a change, and if it's false, that would mean there's not. But we need to dynamically set this based off of if the value in these individual text inputs have changed. So essentially what we're going to be doing is comparing the default value of these objects with the current value. So in the default property of our toggle, we can compare the value from our data source. So let's start off with the title field. So we can point it to this item.title, and we can say if that is not equal to, so you can do a not equal if you haven't did this before, with a less than and greater than characters back to back. And we're going to compare that to the actual text input value in the gallery. So title field is mapped to this text input 2. So I can just type text input 2. And you notice with Power Apps, when you type in a property like that, it highlights the text bar in green. So that's pretty helpful to make sure that you have the right one. And if we do a dot after that and point it to the .text property, that's going to get whatever is in the text field in that value. So we're comparing essentially the default value from our data source with whatever's typed into this text box, and we're seeing if those are the same. If they're not the same, that means this has been changed. So this toggle needs to be on. And when you're doing a comparison like this, it's going to evaluate to false, in this case, if they are the same, and true if they're not. So that will set our toggle to whatever we need it to be. So I can really just go in with each of the different columns in my gallery and do this same evaluation. And I need to split these out with an OR. So you can do that either by typing or I like to do it with the 2 parallel lines just because I come from a coding background and I'm used to that. So we're saying if title from our data source is not equal to the title that's in the text, then turn the toggle on. Or if the category from our data source is not equal to the text input 2_1 dot text. And then we'll just keep doing this for each of the different fields. And you notice as I type this out, we have 2 warnings on the length and the spots available ones. That's because these are number fields in my SharePoint data source. So I need to make sure that this is evaluated as a number field and that they match in their type. So to handle that, when I'm comparing it in the text input.text, I can wrap that in a function called value so that it's evaluating them as the same data types. And you see as soon as I do that, that underline error goes away. Now we can see real-time feedback that this is working because I did change the value in this line so that toggle's on, but I haven't changed this line yet so the toggle's off. If I go in here and make a change, see as soon as I do, it evaluates that those don't match and it gets toggled to on. If I were to delete that and make that match up to what it was, it's back to off. And that's real time. So one thing that I'll point out how this is happening, in each of these text input boxes, if you select it and go to the drop down, there's a property called delay output. So this is set to false by default. So what this is doing for us, it means each time you type into this text box, it's evaluating. So that's how it knows as soon as I type to toggle that to on. If we are to set this delay output to true, I'll show you what that does and how that affects our code. It's not going to evaluate in that case until we're done typing. So I can be typing a bunch of stuff here, but until I get to like a pause, does it actually reevaluate? So you might consider turning that on just for a performance enhancement. Typically that'll help your performance a little bit if that delay output is set to true. Now that we've confirmed that this toggle is in fact working, we can hide this from our end users. We can select the toggle and set the visibility to off. With the mechanism in place now to detect items that have changed, now we can go and patch this back to our data source. That's when we'll go back to our save button and go to its onSelect property. And here's where we want to use the for all function, because this is going to let us loop through the gallery of items. Within the for all, we're going to use a filter formula because we want to filter out and only show the values where the toggle value is true. So we're going to filter gallery to dot all items, because it gets all the items from the gallery, where toggle1 dot value equals true. So now that we only have the changed items, now we can go in and do a patch. A patch is what lets us right back to our data source. So we can do a patch, point it to our SharePoint list, which is training, and then we can use the this record function because that gets the current record that we are in the loop. So it knows which item to update. And then we just have to map our property. So we're going to do an open and a close curly brace, and we'll map the title field to our text input to.text, and just continue this on for the individual columns that we're going to write back to. Again, if you have like a number column, make sure that you're using that value function so that it's in the correct data type. And now some moment of truth. Let's run this. Going to make a change to this row only. Click save. Let's go back to our data source. We'll do a refresh. And there you go. There's Power Automate, testing update in the record. Now that we've got the save working, let's take a look at some other areas you might want to add to this. So if you're using an editable grid like this, you might need a mechanism to add a new row into this grid. So rather than going off to a new form screen, you might want to do this all in line. So to handle that, we can add in an add icon, and on its onSelect property, you can essentially just patch a new empty row to your data source. Now you can do this either to the data source directly, or if you are leveraging like a collection approach to this instead. So maybe you on your app on start were getting a collection of all the data from your data source and binding that to the gallery and then patching that all at once. That's another way that you could tackle this as well. But for this example, what I've been showing, we're just doing it directly to the data source. So we'll do a patch to training. We'll use our defaults and then point it to training so it knows it's a new item. And if we have any required fields in here, we'll have to make sure in this patch that we put something in there. So for example, I think title is required. So I'll just put in some sample value. And then when we patch that, we'll need to also make sure we refresh the data source so that the gallery sees that new record. So let's play this, click the plus. We see the new row in there with our sample data. So now we can fill in the properties for this particular record. Another thing you might want to do is delete a row inline. So to do that, we can go into our gallery and let's just add in a trash can icon, and we'll kind of position that to the far right. And then we'll go to its onSelect property. And this can be as simple as using the remove function. So we can point that to our data source and just use the this item function to remove the currently selected item. You could expand this, and I have a video on how to do a dialog box. So you could have a pop-up when they click this show up saying, are you sure you want to delete this? That's another thing that you could do to kind of safeguard against any accidental deletes. And when you do a remove like that, again, you'll want to make sure that you are refreshing your data source so that those updates are reflected in your gallery. So again, to test this one out, maybe we didn't really need to add in that new row here, so I can click the trash can, removes it from our data source, and our gallery is updated. One more thing I'll show, there might be an instance where, similar to the example we were looking at with SharePoint, how by default it's not an editable grid, but you click a button to turn it into that. So if we wanted to mimic that exact same functionality in our Power App, we could add that logic in also. So we can just insert a button, give it a text value, say like edit in table, and then on the select of this button, we can utilize a global variable. So we can use set, we'll call this edit grid, and we'll set that to true. Now if we're setting it to true, on button click, we'll copy this formula, and in our app on start, let's just initially set that to false so that when it's first loaded, it's not an editable grid, but when we click the button, it is. Now that we have this global variable, we can key off of it and set the display mode property of our text inputs in our gallery. So starting with this one, if we select the text input, click the drop down in the properties pane, there's a display mode property. The default is edit, meaning that you can edit the information in it, but we can control this to either disabled or view. So we're going to use a formula in here. So we'll say if edit grid equals true, then it should be display mode edit. Otherwise, let's make it view only. And then we can just use this same formula in the other text inputs. Now, instead of typing this formula over and over again, on the other text inputs, I'm going to select the text input, go to its display mode property, and I'm going to just tie that to the initial text input I just set that on, it's display mode property. So essentially that's just saying, hey, whatever the display mode is of this text input, make it the same in this one. So now I'm going to copy that and set that in the other two text inputs. And you see when we set that to view, the lines go away. So it looks just like a normal table of information. But then when I click Edit in Table, our lines show up and we can edit it. So I can't change anything right now. Click Edit in Table. Now I can. All right, I think I've covered the basics of inline editing your tables with Power Apps. I'll actually go ahead and upload this into GitHub. So if you want to just download this application and see the working sample, you can. As always, let me know if you have any ideas for future videos. And if you found this helpful, please like, subscribe, share, and I'll catch you in the next video.